The first group is, of course, also the most important because it's the one that's mentioned most within, particularly the gospel writings. And that group is called the Pharisees. And so, the Pharisees, they're not really dealt with very well within the synoptics particularly. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we see the Pharisees have really come under a huge amount of criticism, both by the writers of the Gospels themselves and by Jesus himself. John's Gospel is a little different in that John's Gospel shows a different side to the Pharisees as well, because there we get to meet other Pharisees who obviously are on Jesus' side, people like Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea. But how do we come to terms with who the Pharisees were? Many scholars believe that the Pharisees originate during the period called the Maccabean Revolt or the Maccabean period. You may remember from a previous module we did the intertestamental period, that period between the end of the Tanakh and the beginning of the New Testament. And in that period was this 100 years in which the Jews actually were able to rule themselves under this group called the Maccabees. And so some believe that it's during this period, that period of religious revival and political aspiration, that in fact is where the Pharisees came from. However, that doesn't seem to be quite right, because it looks as if the Pharisees actually originated a little later. Now the reason why I say this is because the Tanakh never mentions Pharisees. Even the books of the Apocrypha never mentions the Pharisees. And so in that case, where do they come from? Well, maybe a clue to understanding where they come from comes from understanding the word Pharisee itself. The word Pharisee means set apart, or the separatists, the ones which separate themselves. And in this case, what we might think is that the Pharisees were that group of rabbis who separated themselves from the tradition that actually grew up from the Maccabees. Because what happened during the Maccabees was this religious revival based around the cultic practices of the temple. The Maccabees themselves were not only kings, but also high priests. And so it's this revival of the high priesthood that was part of the Maccabean revolt. But you can understand that there were many, many Jews who didn't live within the confines of Jerusalem. There were many Jews who lived now in what was called the diaspora, or the dispersion. How did they understand their Judaism? Well, my belief is that in fact Judaism, right at the time of the exile in 586, began on two different paths, diverging paths. The one path being the cultic path, or the sacrificial path, which was embodied by the temple. And the other path was the path of the rabbis, the path that began to look at the written Torah and the written Tanakh as being the basis of faith. And then not only that written Tanakh, but also the commentary which was written about the Tanakh, which we call the Talmud. So when you look at the Pharisees, in a sense, what they were separating or set themselves apart from was the traditional Jewish cultic religion. Now, if you think of it that way, you realize that possibly Jesus had far more in common with the Pharisees than he did with any of the other factions or groups within his time and his connection. And therefore, the Pharisees might not have actually been a particular group or a faction, an established faction in themselves, but rather they were any of those who were on that other path of Judaism. In fact, the path of Judaism which then is able to continue after the temple is destroyed in 70 AD. I believe that in fact Jesus was really a sympathizer with those separatist views. His denigration of the temple, his prophecy that the temple would be destroyed and would be raised again, was part of saying that that cultic path of Judaism was going to be destroyed, and this other path of Judaism was going to be the one that would continue. But of course, any new path can still lead one in the wrong direction. And I think in many ways, Jesus' criticism of the Pharisees was he was criticizing where even that path of connection with the written Tanakh and Torah, with the oral Talmud, those problems were that in fact sometimes it could lead to a legalism. Just as the cultic path would lead to false sacrifice or empty sacrifices, as Amos would talk about, so the same way the other path had the trap of becoming a legalistic framework. And so when Jesus comes along, he points out that legalism. And in fact, he points it out so aggressively because in many ways, he was part of that faction. And as you'll know for yourself, is you're always harder on your own group than you are on the stranger or on the opposition. And I think that's in many ways what was happening here, is that Jesus' criticism of the Pharisees was based on the fact that he believed that they were right, but what they had done was they had perverted their own path by going down a legalistic route rather than going down a route where the mitzvah, where the law was able to guide them, was able to keep them connected to God, was able to give them freedom within the boundaries of God's blessing. In many ways, those concepts were the ones that he wanted to talk about. So let's not denigrate the Pharisees. Let's not say that the Pharisees were somehow evil people or bad people. In fact, just the opposite. They were all unbelievably pious people. They were the people who wanted to do exactly the right thing for God. But the problem is that they thought that they could do the right thing through following the rules and making the Torah into rules rather than allowing the Torah to be those boundaries which allowed us to have freedom within God's blessing. And so that's really what he was against in terms of the Pharisees. It wasn't so much that he was against them because of who they were, but rather because of the way in which they interpreted law. And we can see that in the way in which Jesus deals with things like the Sabbath, where he talks about the Sabbath being made for man, not man for the Sabbath. What he was trying to say was those laws were meant to help us and to grow us and to bless us, not to confine us. And yet what the Pharisees had done, even though they were on the right path, they had perverted that path. I think it gives us a different insight then to who the Pharisees were. And maybe it also gives us a warning for ourselves in saying that maybe too often our churches have become Pharisaical as well. That our churches too have become places of rule rather than places of law. They've become places which confine rather than places that give freedom within the boundaries of God's blessing.